1437 on December 15, 1944. Private First Class Dirk Vlug was standing on a narrow Filipino road with an empty bazooka at his feet, a .45 pistol in his hands, and a Japanese tank 10 yards away trying to kill him. 5 minutes earlier, there had been 5 tanks grinding toward the American line. 5 minutes later, there would be 5 burned-out hulks blocking Highway 2, because one quiet infantryman decided he wasn't going to stay behind the sandbags. The Type 95 Hago light tank coming at him clattered over the broken asphalt, its tracks spitting stones into the ditches. Its 37mm gun had swung around, the barrel following him like a pointing finger. The bow machine gun was already chewing into the embankment inches above his head, whipping dirt and shredded leaves into the ditch where he'd thrown himself a second before. The air stank of hot oil and burning paint. 3 wrecked tanks behind the lead vehicle were already sending up thick columns of oily smoke into the humid afternoon, turning the jungle canopy overhead into a sooty ceiling. Every time the tank's driver goosed the throttle, the ground under Vlug's boots vibrated. This was not how the training film at Camp Roberts had described fighting tanks. In the neat black and white diagrams, a bazooka was a 2-man weapon. The gunner knelt in a tidy foxhole. The loader crouched behind him, passing rockets up. The tank obligingly rolled across an open field, 30 degrees off the nose. The gunner waited for a perfect broadside shot at 100 yards, fired, and the film cut to a model tank exploding. On Highway 2 outside Limon, Leyte, there was no neat foxhole. There was no loader. There was no open field. Just a strip of cracked road disappearing into a wall of jungle in both directions, and the rutted ditch he was using as makeshift cover. Behind and above him, back at the roadblock, his own platoon held their breaths. They could see him in flashes between the smoke and the trees, a single figure in an American helmet moving toward armored vehicles everyone else on that stretch of road had learned to fear in the abstract, but had never seen up close. He had already fired most of his rockets. The first tank had died in a gush of flame and black smoke when he'd put a rocket low into its front plate. The second had tried to swing around the wreck and instead taken a rocket in the flank at 50 yards, its commander tumbling out onto the hull only to be cut down by 2 quick shots from Vlug's Colt. The third had turned into a torch at point-blank range. Crew cooked inside the thin armor before they could even bail out properly. Now the 4th tank was almost on him, and there was still a 5th somewhere back up the road behind it. He popped up in a crouch in the ditch, the .45 already in both hands. For a heartbeat that seemed to go on forever, it was just him and the machine. 3 men inside 7.5 tons of steel and rivets, glaring through slits and optics at a single American infantryman soaked in sweat and road dust. Dark M1 helmet stark against a backdrop of green. Somewhere not far behind him, under the canopy of bent trees and jungle choke, the rest of his squad held their rifles tight and watched the impossible happen in real time. He took 3 quick steps toward the tank and raised the pistol toward the open turret hatch. The Japanese commander saw the movement, twisted in his harness, and started to raise his own sidearm or submachine gun. Both men were moving. Both were terrified. Both were trying to kill each other fast enough to live. The Americans who wrote the citation later just called it, killed one of the crew with his .45. The men on the Ormoc Road that day watched it in color. The muzzle flash. The sudden limpness of a figure. On steel. The way the dead weight slithered down the sloped hull even as the tank continued to roll. The Hago's 37mm barked, the shell snatching a chunk out of the jungle somewhere past him. Vlug ducked again, heart pounding, brain already racing ahead. 1 rocket left, somewhere in the ditch with the empty tube. 1 more tank to go. To understand what it took for a private first class to walk out alone against 5 tanks, you have to go back up that road, back to the division that put him there, back to what those men had already learned about jungle, disease, and stubborn enemies by the time Japanese armor appeared through the trees. The red arrow stitched on his shoulder wasn't decoration. It was a unit history written in mud and blood on islands that most people back home couldn't have found on a map. The 32nd Infantry Division was born as a National Guard outfit. Wisconsin and Michigan men with ordinary lives, clerks, lumberjacks, machinists, farm boys, called into service well before Pearl Harbor. They were federalized in 1940, part of an army that was still painfully small and under-equipped. Their first months were spent in places with romantic names and miserable realities. Camp Beauregard in Louisiana. Dusty fields where men drilled under a sun that baked you dumb. Then Camp Livingston. Then Camp Roberts in California. They had the luxury of time to learn drill, fieldcraft, and marksmanship in the dusty camps of the early war. World War I veterans, now senior NCOs and majors, stood in front of them and talked about trenches and gas and the Marne. The younger officers, many of them ROTC men from state colleges, talked about motorized warfare and the new weapons the Ordnance Department was rushing into production. On the ranges, men like Dirk learned to strip and reassemble the M1 Garand blindfolded. They learned the weight of a full combat pack on a 10-mile march. They learned what it felt like to dig a foxhole in ground that alternated between Rock A and hardpan. And slowly, they learned to think less like civilians and more like soldiers. What they did not know, in those early months, was where the army would send them. The country had a habit of looking east when it thought about war. Pearl Harbor changed that. Within months, the 32nd found itself on ships bound not for England or North Africa, but for Australia and then beyond. New Guinea in 1942 and 1943 was not the war anyone in those first classes had pictured. The Papuan coast around Buna and Gona was a strip of land between jungle and sea. The ground was waterlogged. The air was wet enough to drink. Rivers were brown, slow, and full of things that could kill you. The Japanese had arrived earlier, dug in along coconut groves and kunai grass fields, building bunkers out of coconut logs and coral sand. The 32nd's baptism there was harsh. Instead of rolling fields and clear arcs of fire, they got 10 yards of tangled undergrowth, then another 10, then another, each step contested. They attacked through malaria, beriberi, and rot, their boots falling apart, uniforms ripped by vines and roots. Medical reports from those campaigns are grim reading. Entire companies reduced by half, without a single firefight, men shaking with fever in aid stations miles from any front. But the division learned. They learned how to move in pairs and fours through green tunnels, using sound and instinct as much as sight. They learned that a man with a machete and a carbine could sometimes do as much as a man with a machine gun if he was in the right place at the right time. They learned to keep going when the calendar said they should have been rotated out, because there was nowhere to rotate to. Vlug went through that grinder and came out the other side. Not famous, not celebrated. Just another dogface whose uniform smelled of sweat, mud, and insect repellent. New Guinea taught him 3 things that would matter later. How to move where the map was a lie, how to keep going when his body wanted to stop, and how to fight without assuming there'd always be someone else to step up. By late 1944, the 32nd was on Leyte. MacArthur had come back ashore in scripted fashion up at Red Beach, photographers in tow. Out of the limelight, divisions like the 32nd were fighting to make that return permanent. Leyte wasn't New Guinea, but it wasn't France either. The Ormoc Valley that cut down the island's western side funneled both sides into the same limited routes. The Ormoc Road, Highway 2, snaked from mountain passes down toward Ormoc Bay, squeezed between ridgelines and jungle, that left little room for maneuver. Convoys, patrols, and supply columns all ended up on that blacktop sooner or later. For the Japanese, Ormoc Bay was everything. It was the last hole in the net MacArthur was drawing around their forces in the southern Philippines. As long as they could run ships into Ormoc City under cover of darkness or bad weather, as long as Highway 2 remained usable, they could reinforce, resupply, or evacuate units that might be annihilated elsewhere. For the Americans, that made Ormoc a vital target and Highway 2 the artery feeding it. The 77th Infantry Division had come ashore near Ormoc on December 7th in one more amphibious landing in a war full of them. While they fought their way inland from the bay, the 32nd pushed down the highway from the north, company by company, platoon by platoon, seizing curves and high ground that looked insignificant on a map but meant life or death on the ground. The opposition was dug in, stubborn, and backed by terrain that hated everyone equally. From December 7th to the 15th, the 126th and 127th Infantry Regiments clawed forward through heavy rainforest and cut-up hillsides. The daily sit-reps were all variations of the same miserable chorus. Advanced 200 to 300 yards, heavy sniper fire, casualties moderate to heavy. Companies that should have numbered 180 men were down to 90, sometimes less. Officer row, stirs thinned. Sergeants took over platoons, corporals took over squads. Now the Japanese had decided to change the shape of the fight. Instead of merely clinging to their dug-in positions and bunkers in the trees, they rolled out something the 32nd had seen only in rare, unpleasant glimpses in New Guinea. Tanks. The Type 95. Hago was, by European standards, a light tank in both name and reality. About 7.5 tons fully loaded. A two-man turret that mixed the jobs of commander and gunner in one sweating figure. Thin steel hull plates held together by rivets and welding. A 37mm main gun that, in 1939, had been perfectly adequate against Chinese and early Allied light armor, but had been badly outclassed in Europe and North Africa by the bigger guns and thicker armor being hammered together there. Against American forces in the jungle or on islands where no Shermans could easily be brought to bear, the Hago was still dangerous. Its 37mm fired high-explosive shells that could smash infantry positions and wheel-breaking canister rounds for close-in work. Its machine guns, one in the hull, one coaxial, could rake tree lines and ditches. Its armor wasn't much, but if you didn't have an anti-tank gun or equivalent, it was everything. What the Japanese armored officers in the sector around Ormoc understood was that 5 of these light tanks, used boldly, might break a roadblock manned primarily by tired infantry, punch a hole for accompanying infantry to follow, or at least unhinge the pressure the 32nd was exerting on Highway 2. Their own situation was desperate enough to justify an armored gamble. For the Japanese crews assigned to the mission, the orders likely sounded both simple and survivable. Advance down Highway 2, support infantry, overrun enemy strongpoints, force them back. They had fought Americans before in the Philippines campaign of 1941-42. WWII. U.S. armor was scarce and often inferior. Many of them still held the mental picture of American tanks as lumbering and timid. What they were less familiar with were the new tools the Americans had brought back with their MacArthur landing. Light rocket launchers slung over the shoulders of infantry, weapons that could make a mockery of thin plate. From the American perspective, the approach of the tanks was first a feeling, then a sound, then a fact. The feeling started in boots and the small of the back. A faint, rhythmic vibration underfoot that the men manning the roadblock hadn't felt much in this campaign. Trucks rumbled differently. Half-tracks had a distinct whine. Tanks had a weight to them that could be felt before they were seen. The sound followed. At first it was easy to pretend it was distant thunder in the mountains. Then, as it grew, you could pick out the clatter of tracks on broken pavement and the occasional metallic smack of a road wheel hitting a bad patch. Over that, the sporadic cough of an engine under strain. A slightly different note from the deuce and a halfs and jeeps everyone had grown used to. Then there was no pretending. Over a rise and around a jungle-fringed bend, the first Hago thrust its nose into view. Small, aggressive, its bow gun twitching left and right. Main gun elevated a hair as it lobbed shells downrange. The roadblock itself was as good as the engineers and infantry could make it under the conditions. Logs crisscrossed and wired together. Mines and charges set under likely entry points. Sandbags piled along the shoulders. Rifle pits scooped out of the embankment. A machine gun or two dug in with arcs down the road. None of that would stop a tank by itself. It would slow it down, force it to maneuver, make it bunch up with the others. That's where the bazooka came in. The M9 launcher leaning against the sandbag wall near Vlug was a stripped-down piece of kit by modern standards. A 2.36-inch tube with a shoulder rest and a trigger bar. A lit key, dual folding wire sight that looked inadequate even to the men using it. The M6A3 rockets in their fiber tubes didn't look like much either. 20 inches of thin tube and fins, warhead up front, shaped like a cone. Back at Camp Hood and similar training grounds, infantry and engineers had learned how to use it by the numbers. Instructors would haul out plywood tank silhouettes onto the range, set them at known distances, and lecture on aim points. On a frontal shot, put your sight just under the turret ring. For a side shot, aim center of mass just above the bogies. Remember, the shaped charge doesn't need speed. It needs angle and contact. Pairs of trainees would cycle through. One man shouldering, the other loading. They'd count down together, the loader calling backblast clear, before the gunner hit the trigger. After the shot, they'd both cough and swear in the gray cloud behind them, hearing the instructors bark at them about keeping low and moving. In those controlled conditions, 6 rockets a minute looked plausible. In the Philippines, with trees, ditches, enemy small arms, and the knowledge that each shot might be the last clean one you ever got, the rate of fire was whatever you could manage without dying. Out on Highway 2, doctrine collided with reality. The bazooka that had seemed like a squad support weapon in Texas became, in Dirk's hands, something like a single-user precision instrument. He was no superhero. His hands shook under the weight of the tube. His breath came hard. He could feel every bullet that whipped past. But unlike many men seeing tanks in anger for the first time, his legs didn't lock. They took him forward. When the first tank hove into view, it fired a shot that went long, impacting somewhere behind the roadblock. That gave the platoon a brutal, compressed lesson in what those guns could do. They didn't have long to decide how to respond. The lieutenant glanced at his men, at the tube, at the road. He knew that once the tanks reached the barricade, mines or not, things were likely to get very ugly very fast. He also knew he had one man trained on the bazooka, who had enough experience and enough stubbornness to make a difference. Whatever words were spoken, the decision manifested as Vlug's hand closing around the launcher's cold steel. He checked it quickly, the way you do with a familiar tool. Coupler tight, wires seated, firing mechanism free. He slung the canvas bag of rockets, feeling each heavy cylinder knock against his back. He stepped over the sandbags and walked out into the open. The first 100 feet were the hardest. He could feel every eye on his back, his squad, the men in the adjacent foxholes, maybe even some Japanese infantry up the road who hadn't figured out yet what he was carrying. At around 300 yards, he could see the outline of the first tank clearly enough to pick a spot to aim at later. He kept walking. The tank main gun fired again, the shell cracking overhead like an angry god. He moved left, right, then off the road, dropping into the ditch in one quick motion. From there, it was the pure business of war. His hands moved on their own. Dump the bag, grab a rocket, slide it into the breech until it clicked, bring the tube to the shoulder, sight post somewhere just under the turret face. The distance, in a training manual, would have been a discussed thing. Out here, it was a compressed guess. He fired. The whoosh and flash announced his position as surely as the impact announced death to the men inside the first Hago. The shaped charge did its job. The tank jerked, fans of smoke and flame licking out of hatches and seams as ammunition inside the cramped hull cooked. He was already moving, working the spent tail out, jamming another rocket in as the Seco. and tank tried to shove past the burning lead vehicle. He fired again. This time the rocket struck a side angle as the tank slewed, entering where armor was thinnest. The effect was the same. Pressure, fire, men cut to pieces by their own vehicle. The Japanese infantry behind those tanks were starting to pour off the road, seeking cover in the drainage ditches and vegetation. Some of them saw him. Some of them shot at him. He returned the favor with his sidearm when he had to, 2 quick 45 slugs knocking a tanker off the top of his own vehicle as the man tried to bring a subgun to bear. By the time the third tank came around the obstacles, it was already half in smoke. Visibility was this constant shifting veil. 1 second, you could see the gun, the road, the trees. The next, you saw only swirling gray and orange light from burning wrecks. The third Hago pressed its luck, tracks clanking over ground already softened by explosions and fire. Vlug let it come to nearly the minimum distance his instincts could tolerate. 15 yards, maybe less. Then he stepped up out of the ditch, braced, and fired into its flank. If the first 2 kills had felt surreal, this third one was almost mechanical. Muscle memory and adrenaline blended. Now he was down to the last rocket, and the battlefield had changed shape. The remaining tanks were no longer in neat column. They were scattered, some angled off the road, some half hidden in the smoke. The Japanese crews, realizing that there was something much more dangerous than rifle fire here, began to dismount in 1s and 2s, trying to close with the threat the same way their infantry doctrine had taught them to close with enemy machine guns. From the side, from cover, weight of fire and grenade. They had not written a paragraph for enemy soldier in ditch with some kind of tube that makes tanks explode. One of those dismounted men fired at Vlug. A short burst. The rounds punched through brush and over his head. He answered instinctively, dropping the launcher for a second and using the 45 to settle the argument. Even in the best recollections, the next minute and a half is a blur. What the division's history and his citation agree on are the essentials. He advanced alone. He fired 6 rockets. He destroyed 5 tanks. He used his pistol on dismounted crewmen. When it was over, there was wreckage where there had been an armored column, and the road was not open to the enemy. By the time the shooting died down, the road in front of the roadblock was a short, brutal gallery. The first tank sat at a crooked angle, bow slightly buried where its nose had slammed into the soft shoulder when it died. Its turret hatch was open, the rim blackened. Smoke still pulsed from holes in its armor. The second leaned against it, rear sagging, track half thrown, small secondary fires licking at its running gear where fuel or oil had leaked and caught. The third and fourth were scattered in the near distance, one with its turret dislodged, sitting crooked on the hull like a hat knocked askew. The other gutted, its insides exposed, the tools of war, ammo boxes, rations, personal gear, strewn around in a ring where the blast had flung them. The fifth burned farther up the road, adding its column of smoke to the darkening sky. The Japanese infantry who had been counting on those vehicles to break the barricade hesitated, then melted back into the trees. Without armor to shield them, charging a built roadblock manned by combat-experienced Americans was a new proposition entirely. When other GIs finally moved forward from behind the sandbag wall, they did so cautiously, expecting more fight, more danger. What they found instead was a man who seemed, at first glance, strangely ordinary. Dirk J. Vlug didn't look like the newspaper caricature of a hero. He looked like any other soldier who'd been in the jungle too long. He was smeared with sweat and mud, eyes wide but focused, his uniform stained with dirt and powder burn. There were spent rocket tails lying in the ditch and on the road where he'd dropped them. The empty bazooka tube rested against the embankment, its paint scorched and blackened. The officers who logged the action did their best to turn chaos into lines on a report. PFC Vlug, armed with a rocket launcher, advanced alone and destroyed 5 enemy tanks on Highway No. 2 near Limon Leyte. Higher up the chain, as reports filtered back to battalion, regiment, division, and beyond, someone in a headquarters tent read that line, raised an eyebrow, and read it again. 5. Single-handed? They checked. They confirmed. Then they wrote the recommendation that would become his Medal of Honor. On the Japanese side, men writing their own reports struggled with it. To concede that 5 tanks had been destroyed by one enemy soldier with some kind of portable anti-tank weapon was not just a tactical admission. It was an ideological sting. Japanese training hammered home the value of courage and the power of shock. Tanks were symbols of that shock. That their own 7.5-ton machines with guns and armor had been stopped and destroyed by one man running like a shadow in the jungle along a narrow road was not easy for them to digest. Some post-war accounts tried to rationalize it. There must have been more men. There must have been an anti-tank gun hidden. There must have been artillery. But the burned-out Hagos and the testimony of both sides pointed to something far simpler and, in a way, more impressive. Under the right and wrong conditions, doctrine gets thrown out the window. All that's left is a chain of very small, very risky decisions executed by human beings. For his actions that day, Dirk J. Vlug was awarded the Medal of Honor. The citation, issued later, laid it out in the clean, unemotional language of officialdom. He advanced alone against 5 enemy tanks which had broken through the infantry line. Firing his rocket launcher at point-blank range, he destroyed them one by one, killing several enemy crewmen with his pistol in the process. The medal didn't make him a different man. It acknowledged what he had done when there was no time for committees or staff plans. After Leyte and subsequent operations in the Philippines, he rotated home as the war wound down, carrying with him a decoration the Army rarely handed out, and memories that didn't care how shiny the ribbon was. Back in Michigan, he worked, raised a family, attended the occasional ceremony. To most people who passed him on the street, he was just another older man with a steady guy, tea and a polite nod when someone thanked him for his service. If you'd stopped him in a grocery store aisle and asked him about the day he went out to meet 5 Japanese tanks, he might have shrugged and said it was just his job. The Japanese reports couldn't believe that. Their training, their view of armored war, all told them that what he did should not have been possible, not in the clean math of ranges and armor thickness and force ratios. And they were right, in the abstract. What their numbers didn't account for was the ugly, particular human reality of a man who'd come up through New Guinea's swamps and Leyte's hills, who understood that sometimes the front shrinks down to one man, one weapon, and a road that cannot be allowed to open. 6 rockets and a pistol don't sound like a recipe for killing 5 tanks. On a narrow patch of Highway 2 in December 1944, in air filled with jungle heat and burning fuel, they were enough.